Okay, so welcome everybody today to our presentation, How to Cool Your Home with Vegetation in the Eastern Suburbs. Thank you all for coming. Before I start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the country throughout Australia that we are all working and living on. For me, it's the Bidjigal and the Gadigal people, and pay respect to their connection to land, sea, sky and community. And we pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people today. So I'd like to welcome Samir Tabassum from Macquarie University, and Samir and I are going to co-present this presentation today. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat and we will respond at the end. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of background on this project. So the idea for this webinar came out of a research project that Waverley, Woollahra and Randwick Council have done with funding from the New South Wales Government and LGNSW. And that project was called the Future-Proofing Residential Development to Climate Change. And what we did, we took 5 buildings that were approved for development last year, and we modelled those buildings using a future climate file for 2030 and 2070. And we wanted to see how are the homes that we're building today, how will they cope as the climate warms in regards to the thermal comfort of those homes and how much energy and water they consume. So the key finding was that simply under climate change, so as the climate warms, it will be harder to keep our homes cool and we will need to use more cooling energy. So by 2030, we will need to use 70% more cooling energy than currently we do. And by 2070, that jumps up to 300%. So there'll be a lot more reliance on mechanical cooling. So we went back to the consultants and said, what can we do to these homes to make them more thermally comfortable without having to rely on air conditioning? And fortunately, with good passive solar design principles, we can really improve their performance. So things like insulation, high performance glazing, shading, there's many things that we can do to improve the situation, which is great news. So we will talk briefly on those today, but what came about was really thinking about vegetation and how can we plant shrubs and trees in our own private gardens that will cool our homes in future years to come as the climate warms. So we engaged the Which Plant Where team from Macquarie University that Samir is part of, and they gave us a plant list of suitable plants that would be suitable for a warming climate. And Samir will explain a lot more about that program through this webinar. So thanks, Samir.
Thanks, Rachel. This talk will touch on 4 main topics. So firstly, I'll be talking about climate change and its effect on urban heat. Then I'll move on to how vegetation can cool your home and the other benefits that urban vegetation will provide. And then, like Rachel says, she'll then talk about other cooling and shading solutions for your home. And then lastly, I'll finish off with why it's important to choose climate-ready species and some examples of the climate-ready species that will survive in the Eastern Suburbs in the future. So the latest climate report from the CSIRO has said that Australia's climate has warmed by up to 1.5 degrees since records started in 1910. But why does 1 degree of warming matter so much? Like, in the grand scheme of things, 1 degree really doesn't seem like that much, does it? Well, a 1 degree shift in temperatures actually shifts the means. So by that I mean we'll experience a lot more hotter days and a lot less cooler days. And the hot days that we do experience, they're going to be even more hotter. And the cool days that we experience, they're going to become warmer. And these shifts in temperature have already caused some quite detectable changes in the conditions that we experience in the major cities in Australia already. So the heat waves that we're experiencing are becoming hotter, they're lasting longer, and they're happening a lot more often. And alarmingly, you can see in this pictogram that it's saying that Sydney heat waves are starting 19 days earlier than usual. And these trends are sort of mirrored in a lot of the other major cities in Australia as well. These findings that I just mentioned don't actually take into account the effect of the urban heat island, which is the phenomenon in which, like, built up areas such as cities and commercial lots have a lot higher air temperatures compared to the surrounding rural areas. And this is because built up man-made cities actually replace a lot of their natural ground with man-made structures such as steel and concrete and asphalt, which are really good at absorbing and retaining heat. And this heat is then released into the air during the late afternoon, causing the spike in temperatures that you can see. So the combined effect of climate change and the urban heat island effect can almost feel a bit overwhelming and kind of feel like we're heading into an apocalypse, but it doesn't always have to be sort of doom and gloom. There's a lot of little things that we can do together right now that will actually improve the livability of our cities into the future. And urban greening is just one step that we can take to help curb the effects of climate change and the urban heat island. So here are just two maps of Waverley and Woollahra comparing the amount of vegetation cover on the left and the urban heat island effect on the right. And you can clearly see that areas with a lot higher vegetation cover are significantly cooler compared to these built up areas which have lower vegetation cover and are therefore a lot hotter. And similarly, one of my colleagues conducted a study showing how urban vegetation cooled during a heat wave in Adelaide early last year. And they found that urban vegetation actually lowered the land surface temperatures by up to 6 degrees compared to areas that weren't covered by urban vegetation. And tree canopy cover provided a lot of this cooling compared to grasses and herbs and shrubs. And it was really interesting to see that a lot of this tree canopy cover that provided this significant cooling actually came from residential lots, meaning that residential lots could become like an untapped resource for us to combat urban heat in the future. Okay. So how does urban vegetation actually cool the air? Well, there are two main mechanisms by which urban vegetation cools, and these are shading and transpiration. Shade from urban vegetation helps to cool homes by physically blocking the sun's rays from heating up surfaces. And there are two main mechanisms of shade. The first one being shade quantity. Shade quantity is the amount of land area that can be shaded by a plant and is influenced by things like the plant architecture. So for example, how it's branching or how tall or wide it is. And also external factors like the position of the sun in the sky during the day. So a tree with a wider canopy casts a larger shade footprint on the ground when the sun is high in the sky, like for example, during midday. Whereas a tree with a taller canopy will cast a longer shadow on the ground when the sun is lower in the sky, for example, during sunset or sunrise. The second category of shade is shade quality, and this is influenced by the density of the canopy foliage. And so the denser the canopy, the more of the sun's rays is blocked from reaching the ground surface and heating it up, and therefore the higher the quality of the shade provided. And it's important to note that shade quantity and shade quality are actually affected by lots of factors such as species identity. So for example, if a species is a deciduous or an evergreen tree, and like things like tree age, which obviously affect the shape and the height and the width of the tree as well. In addition to shade, urban vegetation provides cooling benefits through the process of transpiration. And this is the process in which plants return water into the atmosphere through small openings in the leaves called stomata. And it's basically a way for plants to sweat. And by that I mean, as the water evaporates from the leaf surface, it helps to cool the leaf and also the surrounding air around it. And this is part of the reason why it's a lot more comfortable to stand under the shade of a tree during hot days. And as the climate warms and more people succumb to heat-related illnesses, the cooling benefit that's going to be provided by urban vegetation will become a lot more important in the future. In addition to the cooling benefits that I just mentioned, urban vegetation can also provide a lot of other benefits to make our cities a lot more livable. So for example, urban vegetation can provide habitat, shelter, habitat connectivity and food for a lot of native animals. Many iconic Australian species can often be found using our urban vegetation resources, such as cockatoos, blue tongues, possums, and even koalas. And when natural disasters such as bushfires occur, urban vegetation can actually provide much needed refuges for these animals to live in until their native homes, until they're ready to go back to their native wild homes. Urban vegetation removes carbon dioxide from the atmosphere through a process called photosynthesis. And this carbon is then used by the plants to grow and is essentially locked up into the plant. So it can't contribute to climate change and global warming. And this process is known as carbon sequestration. Urban vegetation reduces the amount of stormwater in our cities because the leaves and the branches actually physically intercept the water and store it, so it can then either evaporate back into the air or slowly percolate into the soil. And this significantly reduces the chance of flooding occurring. Urban vegetation can significantly reduce noise from road traffic by acting as a sound barrier between homes and streets. And urban vegetation can remove harmful air pollutants like dust, ozone, and carbon monoxide, making our cities a lot more breathable for us. And finally, having more areas of urban vegetation increases community congeniality, it will reduce stress, and it also promotes us to partake in physical activity. And I don't think I need to convince anyone how special and how important our urban green spaces were during the last year of lockdowns. But what happens if you don't have space for a tree, but you still want to receive the benefits, the cooling benefits and other benefits that trees and vegetation provide? Well, in that case, why not think about installing a green roof or a green wall on your property? Green roofs and walls are artificial structures that are partially or completely vegetated, and they're often planted with hardy species such as mosses, grasses, and succulents, which are able to cope with these harsh conditions. And like trees, green roof and green walls provide cooling through shading and transpiration. And also the traits of the plants that are used on these structures also help with cooling. So for example, a lot of succulents, mosses, and grasses that are used on these structures have a lot of thin, small leaves, which are able to transfer the excess heat from the sun to the surrounding air through a process called convective heat loss. And a lot of these species also have like waxy and shiny leaves that are able to deflect a lot of the sun's rays from hitting buildings as well. And here is just an example of how effective a green roof can be at cooling structures. So in the background, you can see a green roof, and in the foreground is a bare roof. And when you look at the thermal image on the left, you can see that the green roof is actually almost 20 degrees cooler than the bare roof on the foreground. And green roofs and green walls represent a form of passive cooling in that they don't need any energy input to provide these cooling services. And they're becoming really popular in a lot of cities worldwide as a way to combat the urban heat island effect. So to talk about more cooling solutions that you can install around your home, I'm just going to pass it on to Rachel now.
Thank you, Samia. That's wonderful. So in the eastern suburbs, our lots are quite dense and we don't always have enough room or enough deep soil to plant large trees on certain aspects of the site. So we thought we'd just list a few other options. So one is to use a vertical trellis or lattice screen, which you can run along the side of your home, and you can grow a vine across that, and then that will act as a shading a solution for your windows and walls. So that's a great idea. Another option is to use a shading structure such as a pergola on the left-hand side with some shade cloth, and that's got a deciduous grapevine by the look of it growing up there. So there's a combination of plants and structures there to shade those bifold doors and the patio area. So you can see that's creating a really wonderful shade for that home. And on the right hand side, we've got shade cloth, which is a really cost-effective solution to shade your windows and your walls. So the windows, up to 90% of heat gain in buildings comes in through the windows. So that's just a simple way to provide shading, and it can be temporary while the plants that you're planting grow to be large enough to then provide adequate shade. So the other forms of vertical shading we've got on the right hand side, another pergola type arrangement on a two-story building, and you can see that that's just providing vertical shading to that window. And the picture on the left is also a really great solution. It's vertical shading, but you can actually slide those shades away from the window so you can access the view at different times of the day when it's not so warm, but in that afternoon sun or morning sun, depending on the orientation, you can move that across and really protect the window there. So horizontal shading, you've got fixed shading, which means permanent shading. On the right hand side, you can see that we've got some fixed shading above those windows, and that's providing really effective shading for the window and wall there. And it's quite a modern look, a modern architectural look, which I quite like. And the same with the image down the bottom, that's another form of horizontal shading that's fixed. You could potentially grow a vine over that, or they've just left it as is. And then the image on the top left is an adjustable awning. So you can pull that awning down when you need it, and then during different seasons, different weather, when you don't need it, you can retract that awning. There's many other options for horizontal shading. And yeah, look, if these are just a few to consider. So other important solutions that the consultants identified for us on how to improve the thermal comfort of our home is to look at your skylights. So they are a really useful way of letting in natural light, but because they're on the roof, they cop a lot of that heat gain from the sun bearing down. So nowadays you can purchase high performance skylights, so they might use double glazing, and so the window energy rating scheme also applies for skylights, and it rates the performance of the glass, and the higher the star rating, the better performing that will be. So that's something to consider, as well as a ventilated skylight, which in the evening, as you want to release the heat from your home, you can open that up and release the heat that way. So that's really wonderful that they are, that those solutions have evolved. Also, you might consider retrofitting your glass. I've retrofitted glass in a house on the western side that had a lot of heat gain, and so you're looking for a high performing glass using the WERS rating scheme. So it'll be low solar gain, low emissivity glass. It's important for us as a society to move away from the dark roof. It's really not appropriate for our climate, and to move towards light coloured roof and walls. You can paint your existing roof, even if it's a dull colour or a dark colour, with a white paint that is reflective and that's custom made for a roof. And there's companies that do that, and that will just really reflect that heat, and it does make a really big difference to the internal temperatures. And insulation is another very important thing to keep your home comfortable, to keep that heat out during summer, and also if you're heating your home in winter, to keep the heat in and keep the room cozy and warm. So it's really of great benefit, and you can replace that every 15 years. So you might just want to check how your insulation is and if it needs replacing. And this is a very simple thing, but it's very effective. The ceiling fans in every room make such a difference as we're moving into a warmer climate, and openable windows just to get that breeze path flowing and keep us cool, just as the plants sweat and release heat, so do we. So yeah, that's a really a good option. Thank you, Samia. And finally, this slide here is just to explain the solar arc. So as you're more than aware that the sun rises in the east, and so in summertime, from that morning, you can have the low-angled sun coming in on your east side that starts to warm up the home. By noon, you've got the sun directly overhead. And then in the afternoon, it's on the western side at a low angle. So you get a lot of heat gain on that western side of your home. So I'd really encourage you can get an app on your phone that's got a compass, or if you own an old fashioned compass, to look at your home and how it's orientated and work out. You already intuitively know which room is lovely to be in during winter time, what's warmer, but what's too hot in summer. And just to have a look around and see what you can plant and what shading exists on your home. And the idea of a solar arc is to plant, if you ideally had enough room to plant right around the home, that's ideal. But you're looking at on the east, south and west side, planting evergreen trees. The bigger trees will shade the roof, the smaller shrubs will shade your windows and walls. And so they're really important. But then on the north side, you want to plant something deciduous, whether that's a pergola with a deciduous grapevine or a deciduous tree, potentially a fruit tree, or there's not many deciduous native trees, but you've got a few options out there for non-Indigenous plants. And the idea is there that they will shade your home in summer, but in winter they'll drop their leaves, and then that allows you to access that solar heat gain when you want it during winter to keep warm. So that's the idea of the solar arc. Thanks, Mia.
Thanks, Rachel. So in order to continue to experience the many benefits that urban vegetation provides us, we need to actually ensure that what we're planting now will be able to withstand the worsening climate into the future. So following the devastating heat waves that we experienced in Sydney early last year, my colleagues and I conducted a survey of 5,500 street trees in Western Sydney and found that almost 10% of these street trees displayed some sort of heat damage following the heat waves. And so if climate change continues to worsen and we continue to experience heat waves that are more frequent and more intense and longer lasting, it's likely that these trees will continue to suffer and suffer increasing amounts of damage, and they may not actually be able to recover. So how do you know if a species is climate ready for your area? So I've been fortunate enough to work with the Which Plant Where project, which is a culmination of 5 years of research looking at horticultural species that will survive in the Australian climate both now and into the future. So we're about to launch an interactive tool towards the end of the year in which users can search by location and also search by species to find what would be climate ready in their areas. And the website will also contain information on lots of useful plant traits, such as tolerances, including for drought, coastal, and frost. So we had a look to see what species would be climate ready for the eastern suburbs going into the future. And here are just some examples that we found. So first up is heath-leafed banksia. It's a fast-growing large shrub to small tree, and it naturally occurs in the Sydney region. It's quite drought and coastal tolerant, and it's an excellent food source for native birds. Scrub sheoak is also another medium shrub to small tree. It's a excellent drought and coastal tolerance, and it's a good species to use as a windbreak. The fruit of these trees are a good source of food for native large parrots, and the tree itself provides a good nesting habitat for native birds as well. So lily pillies are an iconic species that grow along the east coast of Australia. They're quite fast growing and they produce very distinctive pink new growth. The fruit, although it's kind of tart, is actually widely used to make jams. Coastal rosemary is another fast-growing native shrub, and it's native to New South Wales. As its name suggests, it has quite a high coastal tolerance, and it's a species that is very popularly used as a hedge or a topiary species. Bracelet honey myrtle is a fast-growing shrub that produces white flowers that are quite attractive to nectar-feeding birds. It's well suited to coastal conditions and it's an excellent plant to use as a screen. Golden guinea vine is a fast-growing climber that's often planted along fences, or it can be used as a ground cover as well. It's native to New South Wales and Queensland and has a high drought tolerance, and it produces these distinctive yellow flowers. Cutleaf daisy is a native perennial herb that produces these purple-coloured flowers all throughout the year. It's very drought tolerant, and when planted en masse, it works well as a ground cover. And lastly, weeping grass is a native perennial grass. It's very low maintenance and it's quite high, has quite a high drought tolerance. And again, when planted en masse, it can be used as a very good ground cover as well. So before you put these plants in the ground, it's always a good idea to consider implementing some water saving strategies to make your garden a lot less maintenance in the warmer months. So for example, where possible, it's a good idea to plant local native species that already have low water requirements. And to help water loss through evaporation, it's a good idea to plant an understory of herbs or ground covers and also mulch around your plants as well. And soil additives like biochar actually increase the water holding capacity of soils, so they can potentially give your plants a fighting chance during drought times. So another good tip is to install a rainwater tank to help irrigate your garden, and to consider installing drip irrigation lines to reduce water loss as well. And lastly, if you do need to water your plants, it's a good idea to water early in the morning so that the plants have enough water to keep themselves cool during the heat of the day. And all this information, including information on what plants will be climate ready for the Eastern Suburbs, will all be included in a fact sheet that will be disseminated to participants of this webinar in the next few weeks. So that's the end of the talk. Thank you everyone for coming and listening. I'll just leave it on this resources page if people want to do some further reading. But now Rachel and I are happy to take any questions. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Samia. And one thing just before questions I wanted to mention is that we do have a verge tree planting program at Waverley Council, and I'm sure the other councils do have a similar program. I will email you the links there, but often if your block isn't big enough to plant on your block, but there is room on the verge, the street tree team can work with you to pick something that's appropriate for the area, and yes, that's another good option. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Samia.